Hi guys, welcome back to the Soul Food Podcast, a safe space where we talk about God, the Bible, theology, and the Christian life in general. I'm your host, Noma. As you guys know, for season 2, I am talking about some topics of conversation that have been mislabeled as taboo within some Christian circles from a biblical perspective, because the Bible is sufficient for faith and practice. Today's taboo topic is church hurt. This episode was inspired by the church or cult Twitter conversation where people shared their personal experiences of church hurt. This was sparked by a short video that BBC News UK released in November 2021 of a young lady called Jess who was recruited into the Shincheonji Church of Jesus while a student at university, which she later discovered was actually a cult. Given how triggering Jess's story was for so many people online, I want to address this topic with the sensitivity and grace that it deserves on this platform. So help me God. Spoiler alert, if you haven't watched the BBC video, I am going to put the link in the description box so you can pause this here, watch that first, and then come back because that's going to be my case study. Now, for anyone who may not be familiar with the term church hurt, it refers to any form of abuse that an individual has suffered either directly at the hands of the leader of a church, i.e. the main pastor, or by the members of said church. I feel like we live in a time whereby church hurt is so prevalent and it is shipwrecking people's faith and destroying lives. Well, this is going to be a 3-part series because it's such a big topic, so bear with me guys, this is just part 1. First, I would like to commend and thank Jess for speaking out and raising awareness on this issue, because it takes courage to speak about any form of abuse you've experienced openly. There's always the fear that people might not believe you or respond with compassion when you tell them. So I really do commend her for sharing her story. That couldn't have been easy. The dictionary definition of a cult is a social group with socially deviant or novel religious, philosophical, or spiritual beliefs and practices. And I want to start off by talking about the psychology of cults, because Jess touched on some elements of this in her video to help more people identify and discern whether they belong to a church or a cult. This will also help us understand how cults are set up and how impactful the psychological damage it causes its victims. The first component is that cults are attractive because they promote an illusion of comfort. Comfort is a human desire, and given the fearful and uncertain world we live in, it is perfectly natural to seek out comfort in our darkest hour. One of the first things that Jess said at the start of the video is that before being recruited into Shincheonji, she had gone through the massive loss of suddenly losing her dad, and she was at a very vulnerable point in her life where we can reasonably conclude she desired to be comforted. So when the two strangers she thought were students approached her on campus and invited her for coffee with God, she probably thought nothing of it, I'm sure. She most likely would have confided in them eventually about the death of her father, because for her it was probably just an outlet for her to get some answers and to talk about the trauma of her father's death that she was dealing with at the time, and they clearly preyed on her vulnerability. The second component is that cult leaders are masters at mind control. Cult leaders convince their victims to separate themselves from society, give up personal possessions, sometimes a huge sum of money, and devote an insatiable amount of their time to their cause. In general, we know that some victims of cults are even persuaded to give up jobs and their livelihood. And one way that cult leaders practice their mind control on their victims is by brainwashing them. Again, Jess mentioned that she attended intensive Shincheonji classes in a room in her university and got so immersed in the cult life that she'd lost all motivation in terms of her studies, and all her concentration was just on the activities of Shincheonji. So we can imagine the level of brainwashing that took place in those intensive classes, because this was a young lady who obviously went to uni to get a degree and practically got to a point where she was almost abandoning her studies because of cult life and the demands that came with it. Using paranoia tactics is another way cult leaders exercise mind control. For Jess, she said a buddy system was used to watch over new recruits, to know if someone is fully engaging or not engaging, and always finding a way to draw them in a lot more. She said this was a form of surveillance, really. To show you how powerful using paranoia tactics are, Jess said that even when she was fleeing from Manchester with the help of her tutor, she still had a feeling of fear and paranoia that someone was watching her. I feel like this really drives home the psychological components of cult life, because the sad reality is that many victims unfortunately never leave because of the level of fear and paranoia that has been instilled in them by the cult leaders or even members. It completely paralyzes them and you are just stuck. The third component is that cults maintain their power by way of control and manipulation. We know that cults are able to isolate members socially from their former non-cult lives. In the video, Jess says the group controlled who she saw and what she did. One of her professors even attested to the fact that she was missing quite a lot of sessions, not interacting, and none of her friends knew where she was because she had stopped seeing them. Also, I think the fact that members were encouraged not to Google anything about Shincheonji was another form of control and manipulation, because it kept them, for a lack of better word, ignorant about what they were really about, which meant they were forced to take them at their words, no questions asked. To me, that's a red flag, because if you have nothing to hide, why would you feel the need to tell people not to Google you? This is something that most of us, if not all of us, do naturally when we're thinking about joining a new company, organization, or even a church. So the fact that they felt compelled to tell people not to Google them from the jump, to me, was very suspicious and I think a red flag. We even see some elements of grooming, because Shincheonji taught Jess how to recruit and control others. Guys, this is serious. What Jess went through was no joke. The emotional and psychological damage that cult victims suffer can have lifelong effects. The fact that members of Shincheonji preyed on her at such a vulnerable time in her life is sickening and must have been devastating for her once she realised what had happened. We may never know the full extent of what she went through or even understand it and how it's affected her. Only she does. So my heart really goes out to her. Before I round up, I just want to share a few lessons that I learned from Jess's story, as well as from my own personal experiences of church hurt, which is nothing compared to her story. Number one, anyone at any point in time can fall victim to cult life. Painful and traumatic experiences make us especially vulnerable, whether we like admitting that out loud to ourselves or to others. And when you are in a vulnerable space, you are more susceptible to falling victim of an abusive relationship or community. Think about it, guys. When you are experiencing any form of physical pain or discomfort, all you're focused on is getting rid of that pain. How much more when dealing with emotional wounds? Like we saw in Jess's case, this is because emotional pain and trauma play on one of our deepest desires as humans, which is to be comforted. And the wrong type of people will only take advantage of that. With that being said, lesson number 2 is be mindful of making long-term commitments when you are in a place of vulnerability. This is because operating from a place of pain and trauma clouds our judgment, and you tend to overlook certain things that you wouldn't otherwise. A few other examples of experiences that make us vulnerable could be moving houses to a new country or area where you know nobody, estrangement, losing a job, a breakdown of a close relationship, the death of a loved one. In Jess's case, it was the death of her father. Now, for someone who was grieving the recent loss of her father at the time while getting a degree, Jess was in no position to commit that kind of time and energy to anything else other than healing and just grieving. Trying to balance all of that must have been so exhausting for her. Lesson number 3, be careful and wary of any new people or person that you meet that try to get to know you intimately too quickly. This could either be a green flag or a red flag. And I say this because you can meet someone today and get on so well with them that it feels like you've known them your whole life, and that connection can be genuine. It's happened to me several times. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a certain kind of people that you meet and they try to isolate you, or because they see that you're already isolated, they want to know about any pain or trauma you've suffered in your past too soon. This is because these types of people are not doing that because they care about you. For them, they are collecting data so they know if and how they can manipulate you with it. I can only imagine the headspace Jess must have been in at the time, but I'm so thankful that she was able to escape and she's in a much better place, and I honestly wish her nothing but the best moving forward in her healing journey. So here are 3 takeaways from today's episode. Number 1, control, manipulation, and isolation are key components of cult life and a telltale sign that you are in an abusive relationship. Number 2, brainwashing, grooming, and paranoia tactics are some of the ways cult leaders practice mind control on their victims. Number 3, there are many reasons cults are attractive. One is the illusion of comfort that they promote, but also because of the sense of belonging and identity they offer, kind of similar to gangs. Obviously, there are more content to cover on the psychology of cults, but for the sake of Jess's case study, I have only covered these 3. Stay tuned for part 2, where I will discuss some of the reasons I believe church hurt is so prevalent, and in part 3, I will offer some practical solutions to this problem. The Soul Food podcast is available on all streaming platforms, so please share and subscribe. Thank you guys so much for joining me today. Until next time, peace and blessings.